Human life, scientists have mapped its history in incredible detail, tracing a line from the first microscopic organisms drifting in ancient oceans all the way to the 8 billion people currently walking around on the surface. But there is one question sitting right at the start of that timeline that no one has ever nailed down with total certainty. Where did the very first spark of it actually come from? Most researchers lean toward a purely chemical explanation, reactions happening naturally inside the early oceans of a young planet. A smaller but genuinely serious group of working scientists, not fringe conspiracy theorists, thinks the real answer sits somewhere else entirely. Nobody agrees, and everybody has a theory. But what if the honest answer is that life on this planet never actually started here at all? What if the reason we cannot find where it began on Earth is because it did not begin on Earth? Most people who have never looked closely at this question assume it belongs entirely to science fiction, something for late-night radio callers rather than working scientists. That assumption does not hold up well once you actually look at who is asking it. Serious researchers in genuinely mainstream fields, chemistry, astrobiology, planetary science, have spent real careers taking this question seriously, not because they are convinced aliens exist, but because the honest chemistry of how life began on the chaotic planet has never fully closed the gap between non-living matter and the first living cell. Peer-reviewed journals have published on panspermia for decades, not as a fringe curiosity tucked into the back pages, but as a legitimate line of inquiry sitting alongside more conventional explanations, precisely because the alternative explanations still leave real, unresolved gaps that no laboratory has fully closed. None of that means the answer is aliens. It means the honest scientific position on where life actually began is considerably less settled than most people were ever taught to assume. If questions like that are why you keep coming back to this channel, subscribing just means the next one shows up without you having to go find it. So far, there is no conclusive proof either way. No signal has ever been confirmed. No alien DNA or fossil has ever turned up in a lab. But humanity has explored only a tiny sliver of the universe, almost none of it in person, and the odds that countless planets circling countless stars produced exactly 0 worlds capable of supporting life since the beginning of everything seem genuinely slim. After billions of years of this universe existing, plenty of those worlds may not even exist anymore. Asteroids, comets, and other cosmic events can end a world's entire biosphere in an instant. A fact. The dinosaurs learned the hard way roughly 66 million years ago, when a single impact rewrote the future of every surviving species on this planet. But what if the life on those worlds did not simply vanish along with them? What if some of it left first? That idea has an actual name: panspermia. The hypothesis holds that life is not only present throughout the universe, but that it hitches a ride from world to world aboard traveling objects like asteroids and comets. The fine dust that clings to anything drifting through space, even the probes and landers humans send toward the moon and nearby planets, may carry microscopic organisms capable of surviving the trip and seeding whatever world they eventually land on, quietly laying down the building blocks for whatever life comes next. It is a genuinely elegant idea precisely because it does not require life to be invented independently on every single world where it eventually appears. It only requires life to appear successfully once, somewhere, and then get lucky enough to keep spreading outward from there. Before going further, it is worth being honest about where mainstream science actually stands on the origin of life question, because the chemical explanation most researchers favor is not vague hand-waving. It has a specific name too: the RNA world hypothesis, the idea that self-copying RNA molecules capable of storing information and triggering basic chemical reactions formed spontaneously in the right conditions on early Earth, eventually giving rise to the first primitive cells. It is a serious, heavily studied idea with real laboratory support behind it. The panspermia question does not really compete with that chemistry directly. It just asks where that chemistry might have first gotten started, on this planet or somewhere else entirely, before ever arriving here. Even the strongest supporters of the RNA world hypothesis openly admit there are real gaps in the model, specific steps in the process that laboratories have struggled to reproduce cleanly under conditions that plausibly matched the early Earth. That gap is exactly where panspermia tends to sneak back into the conversation, not as a replacement for chemistry, but as a possible explanation for where the chemistry itself might have first been given a head start. But could anything actually survive the cold vacuum of space long enough to make that journey? Humans certainly could not, and neither could most animals on this planet. Smaller organisms tell a different story. The Pompeii worm lives deep on the ocean floor, tucked directly inside hydrothermal vents that can reach temperatures well past 170 degrees Fahrenheit, tolerating conditions that would cook almost any other complex organism alive within moments. The flat bark beetle survives some of the harshest winters in North America by producing its own natural antifreeze chemicals inside its own cells, preventing damaging ice crystals from forming and sliding into a kind of biological stasis, while everyone else is arguing over the thermostat back home. Neither one would last a minute in space. One creature genuinely might. The name tardigrade, sometimes called a water bear, tends to conjure up an image of some kind of cuddly little mammal paddling contentedly around in a stream somewhere. The actual animal looks nothing like that at all, resembling something closer to a segmented, eight-legged grub under a microscope, and it is considerably less interested in eating you than the name might suggest. This microscopic organism appears able to survive practically anywhere, from bone-dry deserts to scalding hot springs to the crushing pressure of the deepest ocean trenches, and there is a real possibility it can survive in space itself, following a lander crash on the moon that may have scattered a small sample of them across the lunar surface, where they could theoretically remain dormant for a very long time. These tiny, multi-legged creatures can dry out completely and enter something that looks indistinguishable from death, only to spring back to life the moment they touch water again, even decades later. Researchers have exposed tardigrades directly to the vacuum of space, along with extreme radiation and violent temperature swings that would kill essentially any other multicellular organism within seconds, and a meaningful percentage of them still managed to revive successfully once conditions improved. If a creature that small and that fragile-looking can pull off that kind of resilience, it becomes a lot harder to dismiss the idea that some simpler, single-celled organism might manage the exact same trick across an interplanetary distance. So, if life did originate somewhere beyond Earth, how exactly would it have gotten here? There are a handful of competing theories, most rooted in straightforward interstellar physics. One early idea, proposed by a Swedish scientist in 1903, argued that radiation pressure streaming off distant stars could push tiny particles across space, though this would only work for the smallest particles imaginable, and most would likely be destroyed outright by the same radiation pushing them along. Shielded bacteria or viruses might have a fighting chance under the right conditions, tucked safely inside a larger particle that absorbed most of the damage on their behalf. The other leading theory holds that the particles responsible for seeding life simply hitched a ride on rocks that eventually crash-landed on Earth, a process researchers sometimes call lithopanspermia, meaning panspermia carried specifically by rock rather than by loose dust or free-floating microbes. There is real physical evidence backing at least part of that second theory. In 1969, a meteorite fell in southeastern Australia and was later found to contain amino acids and other organic compounds that clearly did not originate on this planet. That single rock demonstrated, conclusively, that at least some of the raw chemical ingredients required for life can survive a journey through space and arrive intact on a planetary surface. It does not prove where Earth's own life ultimately came from, but it closes one obvious gap in the theory, the assumption that nothing important could possibly make that trip and still work once it landed. Additional meteorites recovered since then have turned up similar organic material, including sugars and nucleobases, the same basic chemical letters used to build genetic material here on Earth, reinforcing the idea that this kind of chemistry is not some rare cosmic fluke confined to this one planet. There is also a considerably closer, more grounded version of this same idea that gets far less attention than distant alien civilizations, one confined entirely to our own solar system. Mars and Earth have been exchanging material for billions of years, chunks of each planet knocked loose by asteroid impacts and eventually landing on the other world. Some serious researchers have proposed that life, or at least the chemical precursors to it, may have originated on Mars first, when the red planet was warmer and wetter than it is today, and later arrived on Earth embedded inside one of those transplanted rocks. Under that version of events, we would technically still be aliens, just considerably closer to home than most people picture when they hear that word. Several researchers studying early Mars have pointed out that liquid water likely persisted on its surface for a longer, uninterrupted stretch than it did on early Earth, which was still being pummeled regularly by large impacts during the same window of time. If any planet in this solar system had a head start on developing early biochemistry, Mars is a genuinely serious candidate, not simply a backdrop for science fiction. But there is another theory that goes further than physics alone, one that assumes the alien life out there was not simply along for an accidental ride. What if it was intelligent and advanced enough to send the ingredients for life toward Earth on purpose? One playful version of this idea treats it almost like cosmic littering. Just as humans have dumped waste into oceans and rivers, occasionally letting it drift somewhere completely unintended, an advanced civilization might have sent biological waste into space that eventually landed on an uninhabited world, and the trace organisms clinging to it may have slowly evolved into the Earth we know today. Other versions of the theory treat the seeding as fully intentional. Directed panspermia is the specific idea that an advanced alien civilization deliberately sent organisms toward Earth to establish life here on purpose. Two well-known scientists, Francis Crick, one of the researchers credited with discovering the structure of DNA, and his collaborator Leslie Orgel, formally proposed this exact idea in 1973, arguing that a sufficiently advanced species could shield biological samples from radiation during the trip and launch them at speeds fast enough to arrive within a genuinely reasonable span of time, rather than drifting passively for millions of years the way an unguided rock or dust particle would have to. Crick, notably, was one of the researchers who helped establish the physical structure of DNA in the first place, which lent his later, considerably far stranger idea. A level of credibility it might not have received, coming from someone working entirely outside mainstream biology. That version sidesteps a lot of the survival problems built into the accidental theories, since deliberate senders would obviously plan around the very risks that make random hitchhiking so unlikely to succeed. So, why would any civilization bother seeding a planet on purpose? One leading explanation is survival insurance. Even the most advanced society imaginable can be wiped out by a natural disaster or a poorly timed comet, and spreading life across more than one world protects it against exactly that kind of single catastrophic event. Of course, that seeding, if it happened at all, would have taken place something like 3.5 billion years ago, an almost incomprehensible stretch of time by any civilization's standard, which means any civilization responsible for it is almost certainly long gone by now, extinct, evolved into something unrecognizable, or simply moved on entirely, unless it is not. There are plenty of theories about aliens actively making contact with Earth, and so far none of them have produced anything close to conclusive proof, regardless of how many people insist they were personally abducted. But if alien life is out there, and may even be tied to the origin of life on this planet, why has it never actually reached out? One answer is that it simply does not want to, at least not yet. This idea has a name too, the zoo hypothesis, which suggests humanity is essentially living inside an enormous, carefully maintained enclosure, observed closely but deliberately left undisturbed. Whatever these civilizations are, the theory goes, they possess technology far beyond ours and are content to quietly observe while our still developing planet works things out on its own timeline. If we have no evidence of their existence, it is only because they have decided we are not supposed to have it yet. Does that idea hold up under scrutiny? There is one significant problem with it. Try getting even 10 people to agree on where to eat dinner. Now imagine convincing an entire civilization to maintain total secrecy indefinitely, across millions of years, with every single individual across countless generations never once breaking that silence, or accidentally revealing themselves to their so-called human exhibit. That level of coordinated silence is exactly why critics argue the zoo hypothesis has more in common with religious faith than with panspermia's testable, physics-based claims. Panspermia at least makes predictions that can, in principle, be checked against physical evidence, meteorite chemistry, the survival limits of extremophiles, the composition of interstellar dust. The zoo hypothesis, by contrast, is built specifically so that no observation could ever disprove it, since any absence of evidence simply gets folded back into the theory as further proof of how carefully hidden the Watchers supposedly are. Has any civilization actually maintained a completely hands-off approach the entire time, though? A far more popular idea among casual audiences, though considerably less popular among working scientists, holds that Earth has been visited repeatedly by advanced civilizations that interacted directly with humans well before recorded history began. Known as the ancient astronauts theory, it draws heavily on religious tradition, since countless sacred texts across unrelated, geographically distant cultures independently describe powerful, mysterious beings descending from the sky to perform miracles or deliver knowledge. Is there evidence for these visits? A long-running documentary-style television series spent 16 seasons and nearly 200 episodes arguing there is plenty, pointing to myths about giants and gods, massive structures like the pyramids appearing on multiple continents with no apparent contact between the cultures that built them, and devices that look far too advanced for their era, like the intricate clockwork mechanism recovered from an ancient Greek shipwreck. A device so mechanically sophisticated that nothing comparable would reappear in the historical record for well over 1,000 years afterward. That series built a genuinely large audience, and just as many critics. The ancient astronauts theory, and that particular program especially, has been repeatedly accused by historians and archaeologists of cherry-picking evidence, ignoring inconvenient counterexamples, and consistently dismissing the genuine engineering skill and ingenuity of early human civilizations across every continent involved. The construction techniques behind megalithic structures like Stonehenge, the pyramids of Egypt, and the pyramids built by Mesoamerican civilizations have all been investigated in detail, with experimental archaeologists successfully replicating the tools, ramps, and labor organization required using nothing beyond what was actually available at the time, largely explaining the achievement without needing to invoke outside help of any kind. Plenty of ancient architecture remains genuinely mysterious, including the giant stone spheres scattered across parts of Central America, and researchers are still debating exactly what tools and techniques were used to shape some of them so precisely, but very little of that mystery points convincingly toward extraterrestrials. Even if the speculation keeps growing regardless, fueled more by the appeal of an easy answer than by anything the physical evidence actually supports. Nobody knows for certain whether alien visitors have ever set foot on Earth, but there is a real possibility that alien biology is already inside us. If organisms from another world seeded this planet billions of years ago, we could all, in a sense, be their distant descendants. The most likely version of that scenario, if it happened at all, is that we would be radically, almost unrecognizably different from whatever the original organisms actually were, reshaped nearly beyond identification by billions of years of separate evolution unfolding entirely on this planet. The overall pattern of life on Earth points toward a beginning built around simple microorganisms drifting in water, only later branching into larger forms and eventually onto dry land. A far cry from any advanced alien civilization capable of organizing a deliberate planetary seeding in the first place. Could the connection to alien biology be far more recent than that, though? Plenty of ancient astronauts enthusiasts argue these visitors kept returning well into early human history and may have interbred directly with humans, leaving detectable traces of their DNA scattered throughout our own. As appealing as the idea of aliens on some kind of extended vacation might sound, there are serious holes in that particular version of the theory. Any civilization involved would need to still exist in roughly compatible biological form, literally billions of years after their organisms first arrived here, and would also need to remain genetically compatible with modern humans, despite that same unimaginable stretch of separate evolution. So no, your ancestors almost certainly were not literally extraterrestrial in the way that specific theory imagines. That said, interbreeding between humans and closely related but distinct populations is not some wild fringe idea. It is very real and thoroughly documented. Modern human genomes carry measurable traces of DNA from earlier human populations that existed before our own species fully took over. Neanderthals are the most familiar example, but there is a second, far less discussed population hiding in that same genetic record, the Denisovans. Only identified in 2010 from a handful of bones and teeth recovered in Siberia, they were distinct enough from every other known human population to earn their own separate classification. When researchers first sequenced ancient genomes in detail, they found genetic fragments that simply did not match Homo sapiens at all. Neanderthal DNA was identified fairly quickly, and it turns out most people whose ancestry traces outside of Africa carry up to around 4% Neanderthal ancestry in their own genome today. Genetic material tied to traits ranging from immune response to how efficiently certain people's bodies handle cold weather. Nobody knows exactly how many other extinct human populations might still be hiding somewhere in the recesses of the modern genome, quietly waiting to be identified. Some geneticists suspect there may be additional archaic populations left to discover entirely, ghost lineages detectable only through faint statistical traces buried in modern DNA, populations that left behind no bones or teeth at all, only a genetic echo passed down silently across hundreds of generations. What we do know is that modern humans are a genuinely complicated mixture of influences layered on top of each other across an enormous stretch of time. Could one of those influences ultimately reach back beyond our own solar system entirely? There is no solid proof of that, not yet, and there may never be, given how thoroughly billions of years of evolution can erase any trace of an original source. But the human genome remains a genuinely open scientific mystery, still being actively mapped and reinterpreted as sequencing technology keeps improving, and there is no proof ruling out a stranger origin completely either. Somewhere between a chemistry set quietly running on the early ocean floor and a rock that may have once belonged to Mars, the real answer to where we came from is still being written. None of this proves that scientists are literally correct when they suggest we are, in some sense, aliens ourselves. It simply proves the question is nowhere near as settled as most people assume, and that the honest answer, whatever it eventually turns out to be, is very likely going to be stranger and older than the story most of us grew up believing.